You never truly know betrayal until your own parents fire you to pocket a $2.5 billion buyout. They smiled as security tossed me onto the street, thinking they'd legally stolen my life's work. But they missed one catastrophic billion-dollar detail in the fine print. They didn't own the code. I did. The algorithm wasn't born in a sleek Silicon Valley incubator. It was born in a cramped, mold-smelling apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, fueled by cheap ramen and a terrifying amount of caffeine. It was 2015, and I, Arsenio Mercer, was a 21-year-old grad school dropout who had just cracked the holy grail of predictive logistics. I called it Ether. It was a machine learning engine capable of analyzing global freight routes, real-time weather patterns, geopolitical instability, and port congestions to predict supply chain failures before they happened. It didn't just save companies time, it saved them millions in lost revenue. I knew I had lightning in a bottle. What I didn't have was capital, business acumen, or the cutthroat instinct required to navigate boardrooms. Enter my parents, Rocco and Catherine Mercer. My father, Rocco, was a former regional sales director for an aging telecom giant, a man who wore tailored suits like armor and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. My mother, Catherine, was a certified public accountant with a razor-sharp mind for tax loopholes and an obsession with status. They had always been overly critical of my decision to drop out of MIT, viewing my coding as a basement hobby. But when I showed them a beta version of Ether, successfully rerouting a simulated shipping fleet around a wildcat strike in Rotterdam, saving a theoretical $20 million in penalties, their eyes lit up with a hunger I had never seen before. "Arsenio, my boy," my father had said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You're a genius, but geniuses get eaten alive in the business world. You need sharks to protect you. You need family." It sounded like salvation. I was exhausted, running on empty, and terrified of the corporate vultures I assumed were waiting to steal my work. Who better to trust than my own parents? We formed Aegis Logistics Analytics. Or rather, they formed it. My mother drafted the initial incorporation papers in Delaware. I was so buried in server configurations and optimizing the core database that when she slid a stack of legal documents across my desk, I barely looked at them. "Just the standard operating agreements, sweetheart," Catherine had purred, tapping a manicured fingernail on the signature lines. "This appoints your father as CEO and me as CFO. We handle the headaches, the investors, and the taxes. You are our chief technology officer. You just focus on the code. We're a family business now." "What about equity?" I had asked, the pen hovering over the paper. My father sighed. "A masterclass in manufactured disappointment. Arsenio, do you really think your mother and I would cheat you? We're structuring the equity with a standard vesting schedule to appease the venture capitalists I'm bringing in next week. If you hold 50% on paper right now, they won't invest. They want to see sweat equity. Sign it, and we'll rebalance the shares once we hit our Series A. Trust us. We're your parents." I signed. It was the single most disastrous stroke of a pen in my life. For the next 8 years, I bled for Aegis. I worked 80-hour weeks, sleeping under my desk while my parents schmoozed investors on golf courses in Pebble Beach. I scaled Aether from a prototype to an enterprise behemoth that was quietly powering the supply chains of 3 of the world's largest retailers. Aegis exploded. We went from a 3-person operation to a skyscraper in downtown Chicago with 600 employees. But as the company's valuation skyrocketed into the stratosphere, the dynamic shifted. Rocco and Catherine stopped treating me like a son, or even a co-founder. I became the IT guy. They moved into a sprawling estate in Lake Forest and bought matching Mercedes-Benzes on the company dime. I remained in a modest 2-bedroom condo, perpetually exhausted, obsessively patching vulnerabilities and scaling our cloud infrastructure. Whenever I brought up the promised equity rebalancing, the excuses flowed. "The board won't allow it right now, Arsenio. We're gearing up for a Series B. We can't show internal cap table friction. Stop being so greedy." We're building generational wealth for the family. By late 2023, the whispers started. I caught snippets of hushed conversations in the executive suites. Strangers in $1,000 Brioni, suits partners from the elite M&A law firm Kirkland and Ellis began touring our floors, pointing at my engineering teams like they were appraising cattle. I confronted my father in his corner office, the one with the panoramic view of Lake Michigan. "Are we selling, Dad?" I asked, standing over his mahogany desk. "Who are those guys?" Rocco didn't even look up from his tablet. "Just strategic partnership talks, Arsenio. Nothing for you to worry your head about. Go back down to the server floor. We've got a latency issue in the European sector." "I'm the CTO," I snapped, my patience finally wearing thin. "If we're talking about an acquisition, I need to be in those rooms." My mother walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She looked at me with an expression of icy detachment. "You're a programmer, Arsenio. You speak to machines. We speak to capital. Let us do our jobs, or you'll tank the valuation with your social awkwardness." I left the office with a sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. The family business had become a kingdom, and I wasn't an heir. I was just the court jester who built the castle. But they had underestimated one crucial detail. I might have been naive in 2015, but I wasn't stupid. November 14th. It was a Tuesday. It started like any other morning until I found my keycard denied at the private executive elevator. I had to take the employee lift up to the 40th floor. When I stepped out, my assistant, a bright kid named Leo, looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Arsenio, they're looking for you in conference room A," Leo whispered. "The big one. And they brought the security chief with them." My pulse hammered in my throat. I walked down the glass-paneled hallway. The entire office was eerily quiet. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors of conference room A, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. My father sat at the head of the long table, flanked by my mother. Opposite them sat three men I didn't recognize, though the smug aura of private equity radiated off them in waves. Next to my parents was Gregory Sterling, a notoriously ruthless corporate shark from Kirkland and Ellis who specialized in hostile takeovers. "Have a seat, Arsenio," my father said. His voice was entirely stripped of paternal warmth. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a liability. "What's going on?" I asked, remaining standing. "Who are these people?" Gregory Sterling steepled his fingers. "Arsenio, I'm sure you are aware of the rumors. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Aegis Logistics Analytics has been wholly acquired by Stratos Data Systems." He gestured to the suits across the table. "For a sum of $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion. The number echoed in my skull. I looked at my parents. They had done it. We had won. "Congratulations," I breathed, feeling a sudden rush of vindication. All those late nights. It actually paid off. My mother adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, avoiding my gaze. "Yes, it's a historic day for Aegis." "So, what's our transition plan?" I asked, pulling out a chair. "I'll need to sit down with the Stratos engineering leads to walk them through the Aether architecture. It's incredibly complex. We need a solid 6-month handover." "That won't be necessary, Mr. Mercer," interrupted one of the Stratos executives, a man with cold, slate-grey eyes. "We have our own engineering divisions. We're acquiring the intellectual property, the client list, and the market share. We will be installing our own chief technology officer by Friday." I froze. I looked at my father. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Rocco cleared his throat, finally looking me in the eye. "Stratos wants a clean slate, Arsenio. They believe our current engineering leadership lacks the enterprise maturity required to scale globally. The board has voted to accept their terms." "The board?" I laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound. "The board is you, Mum, and 2 VC puppets. I built this company. I built Ether. You can't just sideline me." Gregory Sterling slid a thick manila folder across the polished table. It stopped perfectly in front of me. You aren't being sidelined, Arsenio. Your employment is being terminated, effective immediately. This is your severance package. The room started to spin. Terminated? I'm a founder. I own 50% of this company. My mother finally spoke, her voice like crushed ice. Arsenio, stop being hysterical. We reviewed the original incorporation documents. You were granted phantom stock options that were contingent on continuous employment through the Series C funding round, which hasn't happened yet because we opted for a buyout. On paper, you are an at-will employee. You own nothing. You lied to me, I whispered, the full weight of the betrayal crashing down on my chest. You looked me in the eye when I was 21, and you lied. You're my parents. It's just business, Arsenio, Rocco said, his face hardening. We gave you a job for 8 years. We gave you a platform. The severance package is generous. $500,000. Most people your age would kill for $500,000. $500,000. A tip. A rounding error on a $5 billion deal. They were walking away with over $1 billion in cash after the VC payouts. And they were tossing me scraps from my own table. Sign the non-disclosure and the non-compete, Arsenio, Sterling said smoothly, handing me a pen. If you don't, the severance is revoked. And we will bury you in litigation if you ever try to write a line of logistics code again. I stared at the pen. I stared at the people who had raised me, who had smiled at me across Thanksgiving dinners while quietly plotting to steal my life's work. I'm not signing anything, I said, my voice dropping to a dead calm. My father slammed his hand on the table. You will sign it, or you walk out of here with nothing. Don't be an idiot, Arsenio. You're outmatched. Take the money and go quietly. No. I stepped back from the table. My mother sighed dramatically. Security. Mercer to his desk to collect his personal items and then see him out of the building. His badge is already deactivated. 2 burly security guards, men I had shared beers with at company picnics, stepped forward, looking intensely uncomfortable. I turned around and walked out of the boardroom, feeling the eyes of the Stratos executives burning into my back. 30 minutes later, I was standing on the rain-slicked pavement of Wacker Drive, holding a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a mechanical keyboard, and a framed photo of a dog I used to own. The towering glass facade of the Aegis building loomed above me. My life was seemingly over, but as I hailed a cab in the freezing Chicago rain, a slow, dark smile began to spread across my face. My parents thought they were the smartest people in the room. They thought they had exploited the naive coder who didn't read the fine print. But they had forgotten one fundamental truth about me. I was an engineer, and engineers build fail-safes. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I walked straight to the reinforced fireproof safe hidden in the back of my closet. I spun the dial, pulled the heavy metal door open, and extracted a single, notarized document dated 6 months before Aegis Logistics Analytics was ever incorporated. It was a copyright registration and a unilateral, revocable, end-user license agreement. When my parents forced me to sign those incorporation papers, I hadn't transferred the intellectual property of the Aether Code to Aegis. Because I couldn't. I had already assigned the absolute intellectual property rights to a blind trust, an LLC called Mercer Dynamics, of which I was the sole proprietor. Aegis didn't own the code. They merely held an exclusive, revocable license to use the code, contingent on my continued role as lead architect. By firing me, my parents hadn't just terminated my employment. They had automatically triggered a clause that revoked the licensing agreement. They had just sold Stratos Data Systems an empty $5 billion box, and tomorrow morning I was going to blow their empire to ashes. Wednesday morning dawned slate grey and freezing over Chicago. I didn't sleep. I sat in a faded vinyl booth at a 2-4 hour diner down the street from my apartment, nursing a black coffee and watching the digital clock on my laptop screen tick toward 9 a.m. That was the exact time the Stratos Data Systems engineering team was scheduled to officially take the reins of the Aether infrastructure. To understand what was about to happen, you have to understand how Aether was built. It wasn't just a static piece of software sitting on a hard drive. It was a living, breathing neural network distributed across a highly compartmentalized cluster of AWS servers. When my parents drafted my CTO employment contract back in 2015, they were so hyper-focused on stripping my equity and implementing draconian vesting cliffs that they entirely ignored the technical appendices. Catherine, in her infinite financial arrogance, hadn't bothered to have an IP lawyer review the actual code-handling protocols. She thought code was just typing. In those appendices, buried under hundreds of pages of server configuration jargon, was the end-user license agreement, LA, tethered directly to Mercer Dynamics LLC, the blind trust I owned. The agreement explicitly stated that Aegis Logistics Analytics was granted a revocable, non-transferable license to utilize the Aether proprietary engine, contingent upon my active status as the primary key holder and CTO. When my mother ordered security to deactivate my badge and wipe my administrative credentials, she unknowingly triggered an automated dead man's switch. At exactly 9:01 a.m., my phone screen lit up. It was Leo, my former assistant. I let it go to voicemail. At 9:04 a.m., a text came through from David Chen, a senior back-end developer I had mentored for 3 years. Arsenio, what the hell is happening? The entire root directory just locked down. We're getting a 403 forbidden error across the global dashboard. Stratos guys are freaking out. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It tasted like victory. By 9:15 a.m., the calls from my father started. I watched his name, Rocco Mobile, flash on the screen 5 times in rapid succession. I ignored them all, opened my laptop, and monitored the server logs via a secure, encrypted backdoor I had established for Mercer Dynamics. The chaos on the 40th floor of the Aegis building must have been biblical. Stratos had just wired $2.5 billion in cash and stock options for a revolutionary logistics engine. What they were currently looking at was a sterile, black terminal screen displaying a single line of automated text. Fatal error. License expired. Unauthorized user detected. 2 PPP. 2 PPPPP. Please contact Mercer Dynamics. IP management. Ether hadn't been deleted. That would be corporate sabotage, which is illegal. Instead, the code had simply encrypted itself and revoked its own write permissions. It was completely intact, entirely safe, and utterly inaccessible to anyone without the Mercer Dynamics master decryption key, which was currently sitting on a biometric flash drive in my front pocket. At 10:30 a.m., my apartment buzzer rang. I had walked home from the diner and was waiting in my living room. I pressed the intercom. "Let me up, Arsenio!" My father's voice crackled through the cheap speaker. He sounded unhinged, entirely devoid of the polished CEO baritone he had used to fire me 24 hours earlier. "Let me up right now, or I swear to God I'm calling the police." I buzzed him in and unlocked my front door. Rocco burst into my apartment, his tailored Brioni suit rumpled, his face a mottled, furious red. Gregory Sterling, the shark from Kirkland and Ellis, was right behind him, looking significantly less smug than he had the day before. "Turn it back on!" my father screamed, veins bulging in his neck. He actually lunged toward me, but Sterling grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Stratos froze the escrow. The SEC is already asking questions. You're going to federal prison for cyber terrorism, you ungrateful little brat." I didn't flinch. I just stood there, hands in my pockets. "I didn't hack anything, Dad. I simply stopped providing my property to a company that no longer employs me." Gregory Sterling stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Arsenio, We are aware of the Mercer Dynamics shell game. It's a cute trick, but it won't hold up in court. Under the work for hire doctrine, any intellectual property you created while employed by Aegis belongs to Aegis. You are illegally withholding company assets. If you don't unlock the servers in the next 10 minutes, we will file for an emergency injunction and press criminal extortion charges. I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. I walked over to my kitchen island and picked up a manila folder, an exact replica of the one they had slid across the boardroom table to fire me. "You're a brilliant M&A lawyer, Mr. Sterling," I said, handing him the folder. "But you're a lousy tech lawyer. Open it." Sterling ripped the folder open. His eyes darted across the pages. "You're right about the work for hire doctrine," I continued, my voice steady. "Anything I built while employed by Aegis belongs to Aegis. But as you'll see on page 3, the foundational architecture for Aether, the core predictive algorithms, and the neural network topology were copyrighted and registered to Mercer Dynamics 6 months before Aegis was legally incorporated. Before I was ever an employee." Sterling stopped reading, his face drained of color. "Furthermore," I said, pointing to a highlighted section, "in the CTO employment contract my mother so graciously drafted for me, she failed to include an IP assignment clause for pre-existing inventions. Instead, I attached Appendix C, which granted Aegis a revocable license. My mother signed it. My father signed it. I didn't steal anything from you, Dad. You simply lost your lease." Rocco looked at his lawyer, his chest heaving. "Greg? What is he talking about? Tell him he's going to jail." Sterling didn't look at my father. He looked at me, a profound, sickening realization dawning in his eyes. He slowly closed the folder. "Rocco," Sterling said, his voice dropping to an absolute whisper, "did you represent to Stratos Data Systems during the due diligence phase that Aegis owned the Aether source code free and clear?" "Of course I did," my father yelled. "Because we do." Sterling took a step back from my father as if he was suddenly radioactive. "No, you don't. And you just signed legally binding representations and warranties in a $2.5 billion merger agreement swearing that you did." Sterling looked back at me, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by professional terror. "He's right, Rocco. It's not extortion. It's a licensing dispute. And, my God." "What?" my father snapped. "What is it?" "If Stratos finds out you sold them a company without owning the underlying IP," Sterling said, swallowing hard, "it's not just a breached contract. It's fraudulent misrepresentation. It's wire fraud. They won't just cancel the deal. They will sue you into bankruptcy. And the Department of Justice will indict you." My father stumbled backward, collapsing onto my cheap IKEA sofa. The billionaire CEO was gone. In his place was a terrified aging man who had just realized he had walked straight into his own trap. By Friday, the battleground had shifted. We weren't in the Aegis boardroom anymore. We were sitting in the glass-walled, 60th floor conference room of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meager, and Flom, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the planet. I wasn't alone this time. Sitting next to me was Evelyn Cross, a senior partner at Skadden, whom I had retained the moment my parents fired me. Evelyn was a terrifyingly brilliant IP litigator who wore sharp Chanel suits and possessed a stare that could freeze boiling water. She cost $2,000 an hour, and I was paying her out of the modest savings I had scraped together over 8 years. It was the best investment I ever made. Across the sprawling marble table sat my father, my mother, and Gregory Sterling. They looked as though they had aged a decade in 3 days. My mother's usual immaculate composure was shattered. Her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. But the most important person in the room sat at the head of the table. Harrison Cole, the CEO of Stratos Data Systems. He was a silver-haired tech veteran who didn't suffer fools, and he looked incredibly dangerous. "Let me make sure I understand the absolute catastrophe sitting on my desk," Harrison Cole said, his voice remarkably quiet, which somehow made it worse. He glared at my parents. You came to my firm. You pitched us the greatest logistics AI in the world. You let us audit the financials, look at the client retention, and appraise the market share. We agreed on $2.5 billion, and you entirely omitted the fact that you were just renting the actual product from your own son? Harrison, please. It was an administrative oversight, my mother pleaded, her voice shrill. Arsenio is family. This is just a misunderstanding. We can fix this internally. Evelyn Cross didn't even look up from her legal pad. It's not an oversight, Catherine. It's fraud, and there is no internal fix. My client, Mr. Mercer, has entirely severed ties with Aegis Logistics. Mercer Dynamics has permanently revoked the license. He's destroying the family. Rocco hissed, glaring at me with a venom I will never forget. Arsenio, you're killing your own flesh and blood over money. After everything we did for you. You fired me, Dad, I said, the words heavy and final. You stripped me of my equity, handed me a severance check worth a fraction of a percent of my life's work, and had me escorted out of the building by security. You made it business. I'm just closing the transaction. Harrison Cole held up a hand, silencing the room. He turned his imposing gaze from my parents to me. Arsenio, Cole said, his tone shifting from furious to strictly transactional. My engineers tell me Aether is a masterpiece, but right now, it's a masterpiece locked in a vault. And my company is bleeding reputation and capital every day this deal stalls. What do you want? Gregory Sterling tried to intervene. Mr. Cole, Stratos has a binding agreement with Aegis. Shut up, Gregory, Cole snapped, not breaking eye contact with me. Your clients committed fraud. The Aegis deal is dead. I'm talking to the man who holds the keys. Evelyn Cross folded her hands on the table. What my client wants, Mr. Cole, is what he is owed. Mercer Dynamics holds the exclusive, unencumbered rights to the Ether source code. Stratos Data Systems wants that code. Therefore, we are proposing a direct acquisition of Mercer Dynamics. At what valuation? Cole asked, his eyes narrowing. $2 billion, Evelyn stated smoothly. Cash and stock equivalents. Plus, Arsenio remains on board as the Chief Technology Officer of the newly integrated logistics division, with absolute autonomy over the engineering pipeline. My mother gasped, practically leaping out of her chair. You can't do that. Aegis owns the client lists. Aegis owns the enterprise contracts. You can't just bypass us. I finally looked directly at my mother. Mom, without the Aether engine, your enterprise contracts are worthless. Your clients are going to experience total supply chain failure by next Tuesday. They will breach their SLAs, cancel their contracts, and sue Aegis into oblivion for non-performance. You don't have a company anymore. You have a hollow shell full of liabilities. Harrison Cole leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. He was a shark, and he smelled blood in the water. But it wasn't my blood anymore. Evelyn is right, Cole said, looking at my parents. The Aegis M&A deal is officially terminated due to fraudulent misrepresentation during due diligence. My legal team will be sending you the formal notices this afternoon. Furthermore, Stratos reserves the right to pursue damages against Rocco and Catherine Mercer for the costs incurred during the failed acquisition. Rocco looked like he was going to be sick. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Harrison, you can't. We took on massive bridge loans to finalize the payouts for our VCs. If this deal collapses, we are ruined. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. You should have read the fine print, Rocco, Cole said coldly. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and extended a hand toward me. Arsenio, Cole said. My legal team will coordinate with Miss Cross. Assuming Mercer Dynamics passes a rigorous IP audit, we have a deal. Welcome to Stratos. I stood up and shook his hand. Thank you, Harrison. I'll have the servers decrypted and operational within the hour. As Cole and his entourage walked out of the conference room, the silence left behind was deafening. My parents sat frozen in their chairs. The empire they had stolen, the generational wealth they had so ruthlessly schemed to secure, had evaporated in a matter of seconds. Evelyn Cross calmly gathered her papers, slipped them into her Prada briefcase, and gave Gregory Sterling a polite, patronizing nod. "A pleasure as always, Greg." I walked toward the door, pausing for just a moment to look back at the people who had raised me. They didn't look like titans of industry anymore. They just looked small, broken, and terrified of the storm that was about to hit them. "Goodbye, Mom." "Goodbye, Dad," I said quietly. They didn't answer. They just stared at the polished marble table, realizing the agonizing truth. I had given them the world, and their own greed had burned it to the ground. The collapse of Aegis Logistics Analytics wasn't a slow, dignified descent. It was a spectacular, violent implosion. It was the kind of corporate bloodbath that instantly spawned speculative think pieces in the Wall Street Journal and dominated the morning chatter on Bloomberg. Once Stratos Data Systems officially withdrew their $2.5 billion acquisition offer, citing fraudulent misrepresentation, the dominoes fell with terrifying, unstoppable speed. Because my parents had been so arrogantly certain of the buyout, so blinded by the zeros on the term sheet, my mother, acting as CFO, had made a fatal miscalculation. She had authorized taking out a staggering $150 million in high-interest bridge loans from a ruthless syndicate led by Vanguard Capital Partners. The purpose? To aggressively buy out our early angel investors and clean up the capitalization table, ensuring my parents would take home the absolute maximum share of the Stratos cash. To secure those massive loans, Catherine and Rocco had done the unthinkable. They had signed personal guarantees. They had put everything on the line: their sprawling Lake Forest estate, their meticulously managed stock portfolios, and every cent of their liquid assets. They used their own lives as collateral, blindly confident that the Stratos money would wipe out the debt in a matter of days. But with the Stratos deal dead and the Aether license permanently revoked, Aegis was left holding an empty bag. By Monday morning, our massive retail clients began experiencing catastrophic logistics blackouts. The global supply chain, so reliant on my algorithms, suddenly went dark for them. Freight ships idled aimlessly in the Pacific. Massive automated warehouses gridlocked, and pure, unadulterated panic ensued. That was when Harrison Cole executed his masterstroke. Stratos Data Systems, now officially powered by my newly integrated Mercer Dynamics Aether engine, didn't just sit back and watch Aegis burn. Cole reached out to every single one of Aegis's panicking enterprise clients. He offered them a golden lifeline. Transition your contracts directly to Stratos, and the Aether engine will be back online for your supply chains within the hour. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a corporate massacre. Aegis lost 90% of its revenue stream in 48 hours. The company was in a terrifying freefall, bleeding millions daily in unfulfilled service-level agreement penalties. By Wednesday, Nathaniel Reed at Vanguard Capital Partners called in the bridge loans. When Aegis couldn't produce the capital, the creditors didn't hesitate. They pierced the corporate veil. Aegis filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 6 weeks after that disastrous boardroom ambush. The sprawling corporate headquarters on Wacker Drive was abruptly shuttered. The custom Herman Miller chairs, the mahogany desks, and the espresso machines were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The bank foreclosed on the Lake Forest estate, changing the locks before my mother could even pack her designer luggage. The matching Mercedes-Benzes were repossessed in the middle of the night. I watched the fallout from my new corner office at the Stratos headquarters in Manhattan, a continent away from the wreckage in Chicago. Evelyn Cross, my attorney at Skadden, kept me updated on the grim legal proceedings. The SEC had launched a formal inquiry into my parents for defrauding investors. To avoid federal prison time for wire fraud, Rocco and Catherine were forced into a devastating settlement with the Department of Justice and their creditors. They had to liquidate absolutely everything to their names. For 8 months, I didn't hear a single word from them. I buried myself entirely in my work. With Stratos's massive, state-of-the-art server infrastructure and a seemingly limitless R&D budget at my disposal, I evolved Aether from a predictive logistics tool into a fully autonomous, self-healing supply chain grid. My $2 billion valuation from the acquisition made me one of the wealthiest engineers under 30 on the East Coast. My bank accounts had more zeros than I could comprehend. But as I sat in my penthouse overlooking Central Park, the money felt incredibly heavy. It was a monument to a shattered family. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in early October, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown Chicago number. I stared at it, a cold knot forming in my stomach, and let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a transcribed message popped up on my screen. Arsenio, it's Mum. We're at a residence inn in Skokie. Dad is having severe heart palpitations, and our accounts are entirely frozen. The legal fees. We have nothing left. Please. We're your parents. Just talk to us. I sat in my office for a long time, watching the New York skyline blur against the autumn rain. I read the words over and over. The 21-year-old kid who had built an algorithm in a moldy Cambridge apartment would have flown back immediately. He would have written a blank check, forgiven the unthinkable betrayal, and desperately tried to glue the broken pieces of his family back together. But that kid died the moment 2 security guards escorted him out of his own life's work. My parents had made a calculated business decision to discard me. I had to make a calculated decision now. I didn't call her back. Instead, I picked up my desk phone and called Evelyn Cross. Evelyn, I said, my voice feeling completely hollow, stripped of both anger and sorrow. I need you to set up an irrevocable, blind trust. Fund it with enough capital to generate an annuity of exactly $100,000 a year, post-tax. Have the monthly disbursement sent to Rocco and Catherine Mercer. Evelyn was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. I could hear the faint scratch of her pen. Arsenio, you don't owe them a dime, she said gently. After what they tried to do to you, stealing your company, gaslighting you, risking your entire future, most clients would let them drown. I know, I replied, staring out at the grey clouds. But I won't let them starve on the street. It's a clean break. However, I want a stipulation, ironclad in the trust documents. The financial disbursements are strictly contingent upon a permanent, legally binding no-contact order. If they call me, email me, text me, or try to approach me in any capacity, the trust dissolves instantly. The principal and all remaining funds will be automatically donated to an engineering scholarship at MIT. I understand, Evelyn said softly. I'll have the paperwork drafted by morning. You're a better man than they deserve, Arsenio. A week later, I received a highly encrypted email from Evelyn containing a scanned PDF. It was the finalized trust agreement. At the bottom of the last page, bearing the shaky, defeated signatures of Rocco and Catherine Mercer, was the final proof of their surrender. They had taken the money. They had signed away their son for the second time, but this time it wasn't to build an empire. It was just to survive. I looked at the signatures for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I closed the PDF, permanently deleted the email from my secure server, and turned back to my dual monitors. Lines of beautiful, flawlessly structured code cascaded across the dark screens. It was a world of absolute, unbending logic. A place where every action had a predictable reaction, and where variables never, ever lied. In the end, business is a zero-sum game, but family wasn't supposed to be. My parents gambled our bloodline for $1 billion payout and lost everything to the very code they dismissed as a basement hobby. I built Aether to predict supply chain failures, but its greatest success was predicting and preventing my own ruin. Trust is earned, but leverage is coded.